B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, April 12th, 2019. The day after Julian Assange was hustled out of the embassy in London. The corporate media is showing true colors. A little bit of concern for press freedom, but mostly, lock him up. And instead of standing firmly for the right to publish and acknowledging that these major news outlets freely use the leaked information from WikiLeaks when it suited their purposes, and the now bygone era when the Washington Post and the New York Times stood firm against the Nixon administration in the publication of the Pentagon Papers. Instead, we see opportunist media looking for ways to enhance access in the future by trading Julian Assange, who is no longer useful to them. It's ugly and cynical, and in many respects it is so un-American. And I see people who present themselves as progressives, who are willing to trade the head of Julian Assange for some sense of closure to Russiagate. And they ignore that it was Assange and WikiLeaks, with the help of Chelsea Manning, who exposed actual war crimes, not just inconvenient and embarrassing information about Hillary's Wall Street speeches, for example. And that is all being lost in the rush to pile on and give Julian Assange an exit stage left. Good commentary from Kevin Gosztola. As you may recall, he gave daily coverage of the Chelsea Manning court-martial at Fort Meade, Maryland. What was it, about almost 8 years ago? And that's how I got acquainted with Kevin. He's got his own site, Shadowproof, and his article today is worth a read. He notes that the efforts to prosecute Julian Assange are aimed at criminalizing a journalist and, more broadly, a media organization for allegedly aiding and abetting the disclosure of classified information and publishing that information online. The grand jury investigation into WikiLeaks charged Assange with, quote, conspiracy to commit computer intrusion, end quote. It falls under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And this is important because, in a moment, we'll get to the analysis from Mr. Gosztola that the language, while it's about what we would call hacking, but conspiracy to commit computer intrusion, the language in the indictment is drawn heavily from the language of the Espionage Act. For example, calling Assange an aider and abettor, accusing him of espionage. That is language from the Espionage Act. And the corporate media is telling us to relax because they didn't use the Espionage Act on Assange, so there's no real threat to real journalists. After all, he is being accused of essentially hacking into a safe, breaking into an office, or helping someone do that. The indictment reads, the WikiLeaks website publicly solicited submissions of classified, censored, and other restricted information. Assange, who did not possess a security clearance or need to know, was not authorized to receive classified information of the United States. And Gosztola points out something that's been on my mind. Assange isn't an American. He is a citizen of Australia. He was granted citizenship and apparently diplomatic immunity that I think is now revoked. I don't know about the citizenship, but those both came from Ecuador. And Gosztola writes, invoking secrecy regulations in the U.S. as part of an indictment against someone who is not an American citizen carries implications for world press freedom. So he then cites the passage of the Espionage Act that was used to convict Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, in court-martial. He says part of the alleged computer crime contains language alleging Assange violated the CFAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Yet the Justice Department mostly shoehorns language from the Espionage Act into the alleged computer violation. Now, this raises questions. It is generally acknowledged that under international law and protocol, which of course the Trump administration may not adhere to, that any additional charges against Assange must be made before they attempt to extradite him from Great Britain to the United States. Now, those proceedings may take a while, and so that may not be imminent, but it is, at least under past practice, required that the U.S. identify all charges against him before he can be transferred. Gostola quotes a second part of the computer crime. The alleged computer crime explicitly notes the indictment is pulling from two sections of the Espionage Act, and this is even though Assange was not charged with violating said Espionage Act. So I think this is very important analysis, and I give this young man a lot of credit. He has done some incredible work over the last few years. Also, Glenn Greenwald deserves a read today, because his analysis raises some important questions, particularly about some false reporting by the media in the last 24 hours. And publishing at The Intercept today, Greenwald raises two important initial questions. He says the first crucial fact about the indictment is that its key allegation that Assange didn't merely receive classified documents from Manning, but tried to help her crack a password in order to cover her tracks. This is not new. It was long known by the Obama DOJ and was explicitly part of Manning's trial. The Obama Justice Department concluded it couldn't and shouldn't prosecute Assange because indicting him would pose serious threats to press freedom. And Greenwald repeats, today's indictment contains no new evidence or facts about Assange's action. Now, Exhibit A of the malpractice by the corporate media is the outlet where Glenn Greenwald used to be a journalist. That would be Britain's Guardian newspaper. And looking at their article where they quote a bunch of people who support Assange and support press freedom, The Guardian says, a key element of the indictment is a new allegation that Assange actively engaged in helping Manning try to crack a password. So, score one for Greenwald, and we'll blame Luke Harding at The Guardian. His byline isn't on that story, but he's the one who reported that Paul Manafort had made multiple visits to Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy, which is, well, it remains unproven. Let's be polite and say it that way. Now, Greenwald continues, the other key fact being widely misreported is that the indictment accuses Assange of trying to help Manning obtain access to document databases to which she had no valid access. But the indictment alleges no such thing. Rather, it simply accuses Assange of trying to help Manning log into the Defense Department's computers using a different username in order to protect her anonymity. In other words, Greenwald says, the indictment seeks to criminalize what journalists are not only permitted but ethically required to do. Now, what is remarkable is that later in this commentary piece, Glenn Greenwald admits that The Intercept fucked up. And pardon my language, but that's what they did in handling the documents that were leaked by Reality Winner. But before that, one of the most important passages here in the Greenwald analysis is the indictment tries to cast itself as charging Assange not with journalistic activities, but with criminal hacking. But this is a thinly disguised pretext for prosecuting Assange for publishing the U.S. government's secret documents. And I can't underscore that enough. When I watched the public television news hour and Rachel Maddow on MSDNC last night, this was never mentioned. They just take at face value that he's being prosecuted, indicted for hacking. And then, of course, they pivot to Russiagate and conflate even though they will say this doesn't have anything to do with Russiagate. As I'll point out in a moment, major media outlets use the Assange arrest to promote theories about Russiagate that are not anywhere in this indictment. And keep in mind, Bob Mueller did not investigate or indict Julian Assange. It is not related to that investigation. And so I believe that there is important commentary that's being offered, but the corporate media, with its power to lead public opinion and to set impressions and perceptions that are very hard to adjust later, they are generally painting Julian Assange as a criminal who deserves whatever he gets. And there are people who will invoke the Swedish sex crime charges, and I'm convinced that that was a smear. It does expose Julian Assange as some sort of a cad, a sexist kind of guy. But it's important to note that the women who were led or in fact accused him both had consensual sex with him before they objected. And that's why I believe that it was a smear, which was set up as a possible way of extraditing Assange to Sweden and then to the United States. And here's the passage from Greenwald's article where he references how they bungled the reality winner disclosures. The Intercept was widely criticized when computer security experts discovered that the document included nearly visible yellow printer dots that track exactly when and where it was printed, which most modern printers add to every document that gets printed. While there's no evidence that these printer dots contributed to Winner becoming a suspect, I'm not so sure about that, Glenn. They could have aided an investigation, and The Intercept, as its editor-in-chief acknowledged, should have taken greater care to remove the metadata before publishing the document. That is because it is not only common but ethically required for a journalist to do everything possible to protect a source from detection. Virtually the entirety of the accusations against Assange in today's indictment consist of him doing exactly that. And why are they bringing these charges? Because they hope the intense animosity for Assange personally will blind people to the dangers that this indictment poses. And speaking of Glenn Greenwald, NPR, where they don't like to do anything live, because gosh, something unexpected might happen, they invited Greenwald to participate in a live interview on Morning Edition just hours after Assange was removed, extracted from the embassy in London.
I want to bring in another voice here. It is Julian Assange's colleague, Glenn Greenwald. He's on the line. He's a longtime backer and proponent of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Glenn, thanks for taking the time this morning.
Sure. I'm not sure why you introduced me as a colleague of Julian Assange, since I'm not actually that. I've reported on him as a journalist, but I'm happy to be with you.
Well, I would love if you could actually, just so people understand, characterize your relationship with him and with WikiLeaks.
Sure. I'm a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has reported on WikiLeaks over the years, just like NPR has. And beyond that, I don't have any relationship with WikiLeaks or Julian Assange, and I'm not sure why you're trying to imply otherwise.
So it went downhill from there. And Greenwald was well within his rights to reject the false information that the host, whose name I don't know, used to introduce him for this segment. And get this, it was broadcast live on NPR. But if you go to the archives to listen to yesterday's edition of Morning Edition, it has disappeared. NPR decided it was a little embarrassing that they had screwed up. They did allow Greenwald to speak his piece initially, and some resourceful individuals happened to have recorded that exchange, and I'm linking to the Common Dreams article where the audio file is available and you can hear Glenn Greenwald's comments, which I think are worth hearing. Over at Consortium News, Jonathan Cook publishes a piece, bit of a rant, 7 years of lies about Assange won't stop now. And he talks about the way he was smeared with the sex charges from Sweden, talks about how the public and other media outlets ignored the fact that Ecuador changed presidents and that changed the status for Assange at the embassy. And of course, I'm not sugarcoating. Julian Assange probably wasn't the greatest tenant to have in the embassy in London. But that is not the point. The point is not about Assange. It's about what this represents. And they have been lying about Assange and turning him into a monster, and that leads to the Gray Lady, New York Times, in the voice of op-ed columnist Michelle Goldberg, referring to Assange, he deserves his fate, but it sets a dangerous precedent. So Michelle Goldberg first kicks Assange several times while he's down. She writes, this could set a dangerous precedent. I don't say that out of any sympathy for Assange, an odious person who initially sought refuge in the embassy to dodge charges stemming from an alleged sexual assault in Sweden. In the 2016 election, Assange acted as a conduit for Russian intelligence services that had hacked emails from top Democrats. Now, we know that this is still unproven. Bill Barr's non-summary of the Mueller report indicates that Mueller concluded that there was direct collusion between the Russian intelligence GRU and WikiLeaks. But we have yet to see any public proof of that. Doesn't stop the Times from asserting it as fact. And then saying, he helped spread the conspiracy theory that the leaked emails were actually released by Seth Rich, and surely Assange knew this wasn't true? So she is taking a leap of faith to believe the intelligence agencies, to believe what has been leaked so far from the Mueller report. And she assesses that Assange wouldn't have known what was true. And if you're a regular listener here, you know that based on Bill Binney's testimony and others, that there is some evidence that it was a leak, not a hack. It could have been Seth Rich, but we're not allowed to ask that. That's off limits. This is a very controlled narrative. And Michelle Goldberg is trying to keep that narrative in line. So she concludes Assange may well deserve to go to prison. But what's troubling is that his indictment treats ordinary news-gathering processes as elements of a criminal conspiracy. And on that, she is correct. Hillary Clinton was somewhat restrained when she was given the news that Assange had been arrested. She was participating in some event in New York, it looks like. Yep. I think it is clear from the indictment that came out, it's not about punishing journalism, but about assisting the hacking of a military computer to steal information from the United States government. Now, given all that she and her allies have spewed about Russiagate, this is remarkable restraint. Look, I'll wait and see what happens with the charges and how it proceeds. But he skipped bail in the UK. And once again, the bail skipping and the allegation of hacking or intrusion, whatever you want to call it, is used to blow big smoke around all of the valuable disclosures that came from WikiLeaks, and to simply paint Julian Assange as a criminal. And then, since Hillary didn't pivot to Russiagate, the corporate media does it for her. And last night, it was no shock to watch Rachel Maddow get warmed up to report that Assange had been arrested by spending 5 to 7 minutes reading from Mueller's July 2018 indictment of the 13 GRU officers. It's an indictment, and she reads it like it is a statement of fact. And then she said, by the way, Assange hasn't been indicted for any of that. And she went into a decent recap of what he is being charged with, and then couldn't help herself, returned her narrative to Russiagate in short order. Today's New York Times says that the indictment makes no mention of the central role that WikiLeaks played in the Russia campaign to undermine Clinton's presidential chances and help President Trump get elected. So the Times is insisting that the unproven and usually leak-based, anonymous leak-based narrative that it's been promoting is still alive and well in their minds. For example, they write, court documents have revealed that it was Russian intelligence using the Guccifer 2.0 persona that provided Assange thousands of emails hacked from the DNC. The verb there is revealed. Court documents have revealed. Those court documents are not evidence. They allege, they charge, but they don't prove it. And this is my fundamental problem with the bad journalism, the yellow journalism, the media malpractice that we have seen for over 2 years, hammering this narrative home. The Times reads, Mueller concluded his investigation without an indictment that directly connected WikiLeaks, the Russians, and the Trump campaign. That comes in about paragraph 10 after they've promoted the same old bullshit. And putting a question to a former Justice Department official, what was the actual interaction between Russian intelligence surrogates, WikiLeaks, and Trump campaign surrogates, she said? That is a question that has not yet been answered. But the Times asserts in the paragraphs before that it's all known. All right, now to the Washington Post. They're drumming up the idea that Russian bots and Russian social media promoters bent the minds of American voters. They targeted Sanders supporters to get them to support Trump. Now, I just find this so laughable. It's cartoonish. Americans had good reasons for opposing Hillary Clinton, for supporting Bernie Sanders. And while I don't agree with the decision that people made to vote for Trump, I understand why they couldn't vote for Hillary. And so they trot out more of this exaggerated scenarios that Americans are so manipulable that, some of these Facebook posts and Twitter tweets were going to turn the tide. And here's one I got a big bone to pick with the Washington Post here. In the middle of this story where they're trying to persuade you to believe that Sanders voters were somehow, manipulated or sheepdogged into voting for Trump. One of they cite this study at Ohio State University. 10% of people who voted for Trump believe that he had been endorsed by the Pope. Now, this is put in a whole article that is about Russian interference. We know for a fact because Scott Shane of the New York Times found the American kid in Baltimore who created the false notion that Trump had been endorsed by the Pope, and he did it to make money on clicks. It's that simple. And tongues are still wagging because Bill Barr, who has shifted his story many times on the Mueller investigation, what's in it, when it's coming out, all that stuff, he dropped a little bomb the other day. On Wednesday morning, he said that he thinks there was some spying on the Trump campaign. And he fumbled when he was pressed on it. But he basically said that the Inspector General at the Justice Department is investigating the Mueller investigation. I think that that's justified. And Barr said, I do think spying did occur. The question is whether it was adequately predicated. And James Comey, the former FBI director, who was here in Marin County yesterday at some cybersecurity conference, he said he knew of no electronic surveillance aimed at the Trump campaign. he says, when I hear that kind of language, well, the FBI, the Department of Justice, conduct court-ordered electronic surveillance. I've never thought of that as spying. Well, as you know, I have no faith in the FISA court. I don't believe we should have a secret FISA court. But it is possible that the FBI and other agencies either fabricated or used the Steele dossier to get the initial warrant on Carter Page. Now, the other side of that story is that Carter Page had been under FBI surveillance years before this. And while I do not have faith that we'll get an honest investigation into the investigators, I'll see where it takes us. And what was really stunning was that the proven perjurer, James Clapper, former director of national intelligence and the man who I believe is behind the whole Russiagate telenovela, he's now a paid contributor to CNN, and they trotted him out as if he has credibility to respond to Bill Barr's plan to investigate the investigation. I thought it was both stunning and scary, said Clapper. I was amazed at that, rather disappointed the Attorney General would say such a thing. The term spying has all kinds of negative connotations, and I have to believe he chose that term deliberately. I'm sorry, Clapper. You have no credibility whatsoever. An American lobbyist, Sam Patton, was sentenced today, 3 years probation, a $5,000 fine. They went easy on him. He was convicted of failing to register as a foreign lobbyist when he represented Ukraine. And on the Democratic side, Greg Craig has been charged with lying to the Justice Department, withholding information about his role in lobbying for Ukraine. And in all the reporting I see about this, they falsely state that the group of people recruited by Manafort to support Yanukovych were all promoting Ukraine's alliance with Moscow. And it's flatly untrue. But we always see a Russia connection when we hear about Ukraine. And I'll say it again, that Manafort was trying to steer Yanukovych toward NATO, toward the West, away from Moscow, and he failed, and that's why the U.S. supported the coup, if not directed it. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Let's see who's on the list today. Lee Hirschkorn just renewed an annual subscription. Faith Peoples is a diehard supporter, $20 just yesterday. Benny Alto, he's a staunch supporter. And Joe Carson, too, in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'd appreciate it if you join their ranks. I can always use more help keeping the podcast going. Visit peterbcollins.com and you know what to do. I've got bonus books for you, including 2100, The Blueprints for Survival of Climate Change, and Dr. Justin Frank's Trump on the Couch. Those go to new annual subscribers with a mailing address in the continental U.S. And my subscribers get first crack today at an interview that I'm releasing with attorney Steve Volker. He's the man who won the federal court injunction against construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. That injunction was upheld by the appeals court. And just a few days later, the Trump administration defied the courts, ignored those rulings, and issued a second presidential permit, which they say allows construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. And it's important to note I taped this interview back on March 21st and then released it to Who, What, Why. And I'm releasing it here today. And what Stephen Volker said on the 21st of March was prescient, that Trump will claim that he is above the law. Listen.
What the Trump administration has been arguing through its Department of Justice and what TransCanada, which is a corporation from Canada, has been arguing is that because the Trump administration issued what it calls a presidential permit, that presidential action is above the law. It's beyond the jurisdiction of any federal court to examine whether, in issuing that approval, the Trump administration violated federal environmental law, including the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Administrative Procedure Act, and other statutes and regulations that bind all of the actions of federal agencies. We have argued successfully in this case and in another groundbreaking case involving a transboundary energy project on our Mexican border that the Trump administration is not above the law, that its actions should be considered subject to the full panoply of federal environmental statutes, and Judge Morris has agreed with that, and by denying TransCanada's request for a stay of the injunction, the Ninth Circuit has signaled its agreement that federal courts do have jurisdiction. So if I were a betting man, I would expect that it's more likely than not that if TransCanada seeks review in the U.S. Supreme Court, they will tell the court that the Trump administration is above law and that none of the statutes that were violated here even apply to this presidential permit. And unfortunately, the Justice Department will tag along and second TransCanada's very unsavory position that the president of this country is not subject to the laws of this country.
Well, Steve, I'm shocked at the imperial claim that is presented there.
It's breathtaking, and it's terrifying, and it's something that we will leave no stone unturned to defeat.
That's attorney Steve Volker talking about what he predicted would be Trump's reaction or TransCanada's reaction on appeal to the injunctions he's won against construction of the Keystone XL. And there was a story from Crosby, Texas, 2 days ago, where Trump signed executive orders to try to accelerate approval of pipelines. One of them allegedly streamlines the process for energy infrastructure that crosses international borders. That's the process of approval of the Keystone XL. And they note that Trump had issued the presidential permit, but the Associated Press appears not to know, or they're blacking out coverage of the injunctions that have been won and upheld by the appeals court. It's remarkable. Catching up on a few stories over the last couple of days, Benjamin Netanyahu, with unprecedented meddling by the United States, gifts from Trump like the Golan Heights recognition, and, right before Election Day, kicking in some extra benefits from the United States. Netanyahu appears to have prevailed, and he is proving that there is no bottom of how far he can go in his craven efforts to hold on to power and to pummel the Palestinians. And Israel, in cahoots with the United States, have denied entry into the U.S. for Omar Barghouti. I got to meet him in 2010, did an interview. He is one of the co-founders of the BDS movement. And he was on his way to an Arab American Institute event in Washington and to attend his daughter's wedding in Texas. But he is too dangerous to be allowed into the United States. Brexit is on hold for now. The European Union has relented and granted a new deadline up into and including Halloween. So Britain will take a deep breath and get back to the Brexit battles, I'm sure, in short order. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, in Sudan. They deposed the 30-year strongman who has been in charge. His name is Omar Hassan al-Bashir, and he's being replaced by Lieutenant General Awad Mohammed Ahmed ibn Auf. And no major changes are expected unless the protests continue. Trump is tweaking Nancy Pelosi and those of us here in San Francisco by threatening to set up a new class of hostages in his long-running struggle over immigration policy. And he is threatening to deliver migrants from the southern border to sanctuary cities like San Francisco. He's being petty, cruel. He's showing his bully side, and we don't know if it's a bluff or not. We have a housing crisis here in San Francisco, but despite that, I'm sure that many people would welcome immigrants with or without documents here. The question is this payback or is it real? Michael Avenatti now charged on 2 coasts, a 36-count federal indictment issued this week saying that he stole millions of dollars from clients, didn't pay his taxes. Is it just payback for representing Stormy Daniels? I don't know. Got a couple of more items here before I wrap up. The Senate, as expected, has voted to confirm David Bernhardt, a former lobbyist for oil and agribusiness interests, as the Secretary of the Interior. And this is really ugly. It's been shown how corrupt this guy is, what an industry toady he is. And they got 3 Democrats, Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema of Arizona, and Martin Heinrich of New Mexico, joining Senator Angus King, the Maine independent, with all Republicans to confirm a man who clearly doesn't have the public interest in mind in any way. And overnight, there was an ugly struggle at the U.S. Supreme Court over the effort to execute a man on death row in Alabama. At 3 a.m., Justice Breyer issued a dissent, saying the majority had denied his request that the execution be delayed so that the justices could discuss the matter this morning. He knows it would have delayed the execution by a month, but that happened anyway. And the bloodthirsty Republican majority says, no more delays, just kill him. And finally today, a little good news from the great state of New Hampshire, where on Thursday, the Senate voted 17-6 in favor of ending capital punishment. That is a veto-proof margin, and Governor Chris Sununu is going to veto it anyway, so that his fingerprints are not on ending capital punishment in New Hampshire. The House has also approved it by a veto-proof margin of 279 to 88. That's progress, friends, and we've got to take it where we can get it these days. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.